Tonight we enter Shabbat Vayechi, the Shabbat name for the portion which finishes Genesis, the first book of the Torah. In this Torah portion, Jacob prepares for his death. First, he makes his son Joseph promise not to bury him in Egypt where he is, but to take his body and bury it in Canaan, the land of Israel. And then, as he is taking his last breaths, Jacob blesses his grandchildren Ephraim and Manasseh, and then one at a time, each of his 12 sons. It's a poignant culmination of the saga narrating the generations of journeys of our earliest ancestral family, and it's sitting a little heavily for me. You see, my own father's yahrzeit is a few days from now. 40 years later, his wife and 5 children are still bereft. I am also thinking of my dear friend, Rabbi David Ellenson, who died a few weeks ago, leaving 5 children, 4 grandchildren, and entire generations of Jews who looked to him as a father of the tradition. I am looking out and I see some of you who are weighed down by recent loss and others for whom this is the anniversary of loss. And of course, we are all reeling from the incomprehensible loss of life in Israel and Palestine these past months. We are still gripped by the horror of those kidnapped, the misery of the many displaced from their homes. The crush of grief can leave us feeling like there is little space for breath, for possibility. It can shut us off and close us in. We see this not only in the content of the portion, but in its wording, how the Hebrew words literally lay out on the parchment of our scroll. As you may know, the Torah has no page numbers, no sentences, no chapter headings. There is no punctuation, not even distinction between capital and lowercase letters. The only way that sections of text are distinguished one from another is through spacing. The Torah does have spaces dividing otherwise continuous lines of words into parcels of text similar to paragraphs, and weekly portions are always demarcated by spaces. They either begin on a new line or after a space large enough to have at least 9 letters written on it. This week's portion is the only exception. There is no space separating the final word of last week's portion, Vayigash, and the first word of this week's portion, Vayechi. You may wonder why that matters, but in Judaism, everything matters. The great medieval commentator Rashi asks, why? Why is this portion stuma, completely closed up? And he explains that when Jacob's eyes closed forever, the eyes and the hearts of all Israel closed. Rashi underscores this interpretation by gesturing towards the Hebrew word for Egypt, Mitzrayim. You see, this word, Mitzrayim, is built on the word tsar, meaning narrowness, constriction, or grief. Jewish tradition sees Egypt not only as a place of physical bondage, but as a word that describes the state of being closed off, shut out, feeling weighed down by grief. Rashi uses a pun to express that after losing Jacob, the people of Israel were spiritually and emotionally constricted in Egypt even before being physically enslaved by Pharaoh. Hemmed in by the narrowness of grief, we couldn't see anything beyond that moment. No hope, no joy, no possibility. Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, has a different take on this unique phenomenon. It puts it in broader context. The mystics say that because the two portions are sewn together without any discernible break, the mystics suggest that we consider that undisturbed continuity as a lesson about the continuum of our lives. In the same way that authors and typesetters divide thoughts into sentences and paragraphs and chapters, we punctuate our lives with endings and beginnings, weeks and months in our calendar, minutes and hours on a clock. But these are constructs, much like the spaces on a page of text. The way that life evolves, moves, there is rarely, if ever, clear and absolute distinctions between the stuff of our lives. It doesn't matter if it happened an hour ago, a week ahead. We live in a wild overlap of joy and sadness, confusion and clarity, regret and expectation. We might be feeling any or all at the same moment. We impose breaks in our lives as a way of making moments, experiences, time discernible. But what we know to be true is that the entire array of our life existence exists together. Everything grows forth from everything else, overlaps with everything else. Everything is connected somehow to what is happening to those near us, to those far away from us, to what happened before, to what comes next. This is one of the reasons why Jewish practice has us understand the stories of our ancestors as inextricably woven into the stories of our days and the stories of the generations to follow that haven't even happened yet. The mystics see the unbroken chain of words between these portions, and they decide to explore how the continuum of last week's narrative informs this week's portion. I told you a little bit about this week's portion. Well, let's think back to what happened last week. Vayigash contains the dramatic moment when, after decades of estrangement, Joseph reveals his identity to his brothers who have so deeply wronged him. The same brothers who once threw him in a pit, who sold him into slavery, have now come to him in humility, expressing remorse and showing selflessness. It's clear they have changed. And after decades of deceit and distance, Joseph reveals himself, and the brothers fall upon each other's shoulders in tears. Then Jacob discovers that Joseph, the child he thought was dead, is alive. He journeys to Egypt, where he lives out the rest of his days surrounded by his reunited family. The mystics point to the fact that the setting for all of this healing, this coming together, this forgiveness, is happening in Egypt, in Mitzrayim, in this place of tsar, of narrowness, of grief, of oppression. That setting, coupled with the narrowness created by the lack of space between portions, reminds us, the mystics teach, that whatever our circumstance or environment, life always holds a mingling of sorrow and uplift. There are many things, yes, that lie beyond our control, but wonders are always before our eyes, always within our grasp. There is always the possibility of finding some hope, of experiencing some growth, of tasting a bit of joy, even while tasting the bitterness of grief. Sometimes that means digging down deep into the cramped crevices of our lives, taking in and savoring a seemingly small, silly delight, perhaps like the kind that Mary Oliver was referencing in her poem. Maybe it's the way that your dog greets every morning with enthusiasm, because sometimes dogs know better, and holding that as a meditation for ourselves. Maybe it means looking at loss and seeing an opportunity. While a relationship might not be what it once was, it does always hold the possibility of what it can become. We can even dig into the narrowness of sorrow and see how the quality of someone we desperately miss lives on as a blessing in those who follow them. I understand the impulse for us to look at the close of one year and the beginning of another as a clean break, as there being a pause, an opportunity for us to leave behind disappointments and sorrows in our personal lives, in our communal lives, in our international lives, and to greet the year ahead as a fresh start, like a clean sheet of paper, untouched by what preceded it. But I think in doing that, we are setting ourselves up for disappointment, because that is not the way life works. And even more, we are overlooking opportunities to shape what lies ahead. Every day, every moment, we decide what we want to hold and release. Bahya ibn Pakuda, the 11th century rabbi, taught, "Days are scrolls. Write on them what you want to be remembered." Again, there are those things that we cannot change. There are those things that lie outside of our control, but we always have the opportunity to decide how we will respond. The change of a digit in our counting of time doesn't determine what we take with us, what we leave behind, what we carry forth as a lesson, what we might ignore, what lies inside us as a weight, what propels us on with energy. Every moment holds exaltation and devastation for someone somewhere, and all of these joys and sorrows impact each other whether we are feeling them at the moment or not. And while we should absolutely embrace hope, I'm also going to break with tradition and suggest that we not set expectations for what the year ahead will look like as being so utterly distinct from the year that is closing. Years are not islands in time. Life has depth and nuance. Our days and our moments hold contradictions. And even when when grief and narrowness overwhelms, there is always breath. Even a line of unbroken text has white space between each letter and word. So even when we are feeling utterly constricted, even when we are feeling like there is nothing else but where we are, there is always some place to breathe. There is always someone who is there besides ourselves. The mystics chose to see that unbroken chain of words between portions as something expansive and broadening. Let's transition into 2024 with that in mind, honoring the lasting hurts of the sorrows and losses instead of trying to artificially separate ourselves from them. Let's carry the wonders, large and small, of the last year as we step into whatever lies ahead. As the French philosopher Gustave Thibon taught, go deep into the narrow space given you. There you will find God and all things. Amen.